Don Recker.
Hi, Nick. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you.
All right. So in a previous podcast, your quote was this, and this is what I want to talk about today. Uh, that we, the information systems field, is in the fortunate situation where we are automatically relevant because we're studying like the coolest phenomena of our time, right? We're in the digital age.
Yeah,
We're studying digital stuff. So what we do is automatically relevant, not like those people who study Monet versus Manet. And those were your exact words, right? So apparently, number one, there are people who study Monet versus Manet.
oh, they
And
do.
number two,
Absolutely.
they're totally not relevant. So is that what you're telling me?
Pretty much, pretty much. So there's a bit of a history to this, and I brought his name up before. I mentioned a couple of episodes ago that I was once listening to Andrew Pettigrew, a scholar from Oxford,
Yeah.
and he talked about different types of scholarship and scholarly identity. And he brought up this notion of what's relevance, what's impact of our research. So um, and he said basically he wasn't talking about IS, but he was basically talking about the business discipline and said, well,
Yeah, management.
it's inherently relevant because he brought up the example of his son. So his son is, I can't really remember, but I think his son is doing arts history. So he's doing whatever some people painted 300 years ago. And he
Yeah.
said, well, in the UK system, where they do now, where they are being forced to actually demonstrate the impact of your work every year, he said, well, I have a problem with that. My son has a completely different problem with that because he
Yeah.
has to demonstrate that there's a relevance today in his dissecting the history of arts from some 100 years ago. Try doing that. Try to prove the relevance of this. And it made me think like, wow, because we've had these debates about relevance of IS research. And I think, well, that looks like, one of these cradles that we have internally. And really, we don't have that problem with relevance. We don't have a problem with relevance. I think that's what I said last time, right?
Yeah. So we shouldn't have a problem with relevance, right? Because on paper, it seems like, hey, we're studying technology. And technology is everywhere. Everyone you talk to, when you go to businesses and you talk to them about their business, it takes about 30 seconds for some technology to come up, whether in their products, whether they're enterprises, whatever. Like, and not, so it is the topic of our time, and we study it. So we should be pretty relevant. So that means that a nice goal of our research is to move our knowledge forward in that area. And if we do, it's automatically going to be relevant, right?
Oh, it should be, right? You're right. I mean, because the way that I think about it is our phenomenon is relevant. What we are studying is relevant. And by extension, we would have to screw up pretty bigly if the research we do on this relevant phenomena isn't relevant anymore. What would that
Really?
say about
Did you ever
us?
say bigly before Donald Trump, or is this something that Donald Trump added to the vernacular? Like you just said
I
bigly.
bigly. No,
Yeah,
I didn't say bigly at all.
you said bigly, dude. It's
I,
just being recorded. We know
well, I'm
exactly
gonna
what you
I'm
said.
gonna
We can
check that. I'm
rewind.
gonna
Like
I no, bigly. That's not a word. Like
that's a word, and everybody argued this when Donald Trump was elected, and he used the term bigly, I think. Uh, and then everybody's like, that's not a word, and then it turns out it's a word.
okay, let me rephrase my point. My point was if our if our phenomena are relevant, then it would be a very sad picture if we don't manage to do relevant research with relevant
Yeah,
outcomes on a relevant problem. Because then, in a different way to put it, we can only fail actually because it is
yeah.
relevant and we can only screw it up.
And when we say relevant, I mean, usually the implication is relevant to practice. So if there's a practitioner out there and they come across your work, they should be, and if it's the right practitioner, of course, like if I'm studying enterprise systems or, then it's a person having something to do with enterprise systems, of course. Or if I'm studying strategy, platform strategy, if that's what I'm doing in the world, the research should be relevant to my work of someone, say, doing platform strategy, right? So, and let me give you an example of some research that is relevant, and it's Marshall Van Alstyne and Jeff Parker. We and their collaborators. Now, if you look at it, Van Alstyne, it's really interesting because he's been studying two-sided markets since the early 2000s or whenever he got his PhD, right? That's his thing. And it's kind of like an economist, an IS economist person studying two-sided markets. So when he was studying two-sided markets, sure, it was interesting. But then when he kind of realized, wait, these platforms, these digital platforms are a form of two-sided markets. So I'm going to take everything I know about two-sided markets, apply it to these platforms, and start informing how people think about these platforms. And he was incredibly relevant. Not only do they have their book, but they have that. My favorite platform paper of theirs is the SMJ one, actually, on platform envelopment, which is a total beautiful paper about grabbing, if you're in a platform ecosystem and you're a platform player in one part of the ecosystem, you kind of encroach on other parts of the ecosystem, right? So I teach this in my platform class. It's an SMJ paper I teach them. Then there's their MISQ paper on inverting the firm, right? Which is also a different paradigm in thinking. These are things that are each one of those papers. Now, granted, they have the HBR article and all this, but if you look at that stream of research since, say, 2010 for Van Alstyne and his collaborators and Parker and some others, every other paper is like directly relevant to practice.
And I think that I would agree with this. Their research is relevant, and it so happens, it so happens it's relevant, especially because it's timely. Yeah. It coincides, the coming out of the completion of their research coincide with that topic also being of imminent relevance to practitioners. I'll give you a different example. The one example that pops up into my head about relevant research is Brett Kitchen's and Stephen Johnson's echo chambers papers. Do you know this? Mm-hmm. The echo chambers papers came out 2020, right in the midst of the US election campaign. And as far as I remember, it got picked up immediately by, I can't remember, the news, the media, definitely, but probably also in council hearings, wasn't it? So it got picked up immediately because it was, it was done right at the right point in time to not only be, it's relevant, I guess, but it's also came out just think about at the right time.
Think about these two examples we just gave. But we're saying both of these are examples of relevant research, right? I'm bringing up Van Alstyne and his platform strategy. You're bringing up Kitchens and Johnson and Gray and their cool little paper on
echo chambers. Yeah,
echo chambers. But the point is about now let's look at it. These are different animals, right? One is you can teach in a business school, right? The platform strategies. When you're teaching a class on platform strategy, you use their ideas directly, and those executives in charge of that will you. The echo chambers one is more of a, hey, if you're into regulation, broad discourse, right? They looked at the difference between Democrats and Republicans, right? So it's more of like a, hey, here's something interesting. There's no directly translatable point yet, but we're
okay, I see what you mean.
We're compiling info about a phenomenon.
Yeah, right? And the phenomenon was really timely and relevant at that point in time, probably when they did this. And I'm assuming they did it somewhere between 2016 and 2020, which was politics, social media, Trump. There was a lot of these things coincided a lot, and they decided that seems to be a relevant problem to society. Let's go and study it, and let's figure out what's happening on these.
Yeah. So what I think is you just ran into a problem here with the idea of relevance. We talk about what it needs to be relevant. We give two examples, and immediately the first two examples we give are much different things. One is relevant kind of in the old business school sort of way, which is, what can managers take from this and apply tomorrow in their organizations? The other is, okay, here's a timely phenomenon, and we're describing some dynamics around this phenomenon. And because it's particularly interesting and well suited to discourses at the moment and phenomena at the moment, everybody's interested in this. But that's a much different thing, right? Those are two different ways to be relevant, two dramatically different ways to be relevant. The only thing they have in common is that they're both timely.
But I think I think I remember the Kitchen paper because it was not only interesting, but also because it was in fact relevant to, you mentioned it, to regulation. I think it was at that point when it came out, which was September 2020, at that point, there were some of these social media platforms discussing whether they should regulate certain accounts. For example, whether Twitter of Trump should be shut down, which eventually it was. I'm not saying it was because of this paper, I don't know enough, but so it was relevant to an actual action, to a decision that was being at least debated. And it had some relevance to this, didn't it?
Well, Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think of it, because if you look at what they came from, right? The echo chamber paper, you almost don't need any background. All you need is some data,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
you identify, so you can actually come up with that paper just with some data. You classify people as Democrats, Republicans, and then you can conclude, and the findings are interesting. The platform stuff, you know, markets, understanding markets and two-sided markets, that goes back decades, right? So the conceptual foundation on which this work is, I guess what I'm saying is, all right, I'm going to give you a third option of relevant. My colleague here, Ahmed Abbasi, uh, he does all kinds of work, but and I don't understand half of it or 90% of it. But he has this fishing paper, this fishing model that came out in
Fishing paper.
ISR
I was
recently.
thinking of a fishing rod. And no, anyway. But what's the fishing?
pH fishing,
Oh,
right?
fishing. Okay.
So and it's all about. He wrote it with Tony Vance, David Dubois, another Notre Dame guy, and Fatima Zahedi, and it's basically a framework to think about phishing. And it's like, you have employees, and these employees are susceptible to phishing attacks. So let's look at different stages and determine how we can predict how susceptible they are, right? So it's kind of like a very prescriptive how to assess. Now, granted, they're validating what they're saying, but the goal here is to be directly actionable, which I think is different than the kitchens paper, which is, hey, here's a phenomenon. This seems to be a pattern we see. Then there's the strategy, which is, all right, based on what we know, these are things that are happening. This is far more of a normative, hey, do this if this is what you want to accomplish, right? So it's yet another way to be relevant, right?
It is another way. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think there the notion is that it's implementable.
Yeah.
Directly implementable. The bread and kitchen is interesting, and it sort of analyzes and explains, okay, there's different platforms, they have different characteristics for different people. That's why certain behaviors occur, but it doesn't necessarily tell me what to do about it. Right. And this one is more prescriptive. You mentioned it. Yeah. I'll give you the other example that I wrote down is by Micha Kahn and my old colleague Wolf Ketter, who I think does very relevant research. Came out 2 years ago in production and operations management. It's about virtual power plants. It's about rental companies like Uber and City Car and BlaBlaCar and these examples how that have electric vehicles. How while they're not being rented out, they can plug them into the grid and charge and discharge energy, and make a little bit of money on that side. And they worked out a way of, generating higher profits while still meeting rental demands, and at appropriate times under appropriate conditions, actually, using the vehicle batteries to charge or recharge the grid. Really cool.
All right. So, and there's actually a ton of work kind of picking apart little elements of this grid, particularly among Germans, right? You're trying to figure out some way to, and it's because I know a bunch of Germans doing this, right? But you're figuring out some way to load balance your grid, right? Because
under renewable energies, which have more intermittency issues, right? So it's sort of not as stable as a coal power plant, right?
Yeah. So you and this is one kind of step. It's a foray into, okay, here's a particularly problematic issue, and here's one little solution where we can make some progress and chip away at that. So it's not the end all solution, but it's one of many kind of these papers that are out there trying to.
But again, very prescriptive in the sense that they figure out a way that if you're Uber in Stuttgart, this is how you can rent out your car and run an algorithm that charges and hooks your vehicle into the grid when it's not being used. And also, this is how you can get your customers, when you're renting a vehicle, to drop it off next to a power plug. Because you need to plug in the car, otherwise this whole grid idea doesn't work, and how you can sort of nudge people to do this. So yeah, it's a tiny little step, but it's really implementable, right? It's really
so these are all different approaches to relevance, and we're basically saying relevant to practice. So if you're not an IS researcher and you came across this, you'd be like, all right, that's valuable. Or if you are one of us and you're teaching it in a class, you could see very quickly finding a way to turn this into a teaching. Right. So the question is, should every paper of ours be relevant in such a way? When we submit can I get rejected for not being relevant? Do you think I should?
No, before we get to this, I just wanted to make the point. That's why, our research inherently can be very relevant. Yeah, that's why I made that statement last time saying, like, we don't have a problem with relevance. We probably have a problem with, implementing or seeing to that relevance. But by and large, our research doesn't have a problem with relevance as other disciplines have.
And there are different ways. So I would say the Wolf-Ketter example is kind of an engineering approach, and maybe the Ahmed Abbasi, it's like an engineering approach to relevance. We're studying a situation, we identify a problem, we come up with a framework, we validate that framework around how to solve it, right? The design science tradition, so it's this engineering approach to relevance. Real world problem, here's the solution, I test my solution. And if I can contribute to theory, or if I can use theory to do this, then I'm good. That's one way. Another way is take some historical knowledge, two-sided markets, something we know a lot about, apply it to a new phenomenon, move our understanding of the new phenomenon forward, right? That might be the platform strategy. And then there's maybe the kitchen strategy, which is, hey, there's dynamic stuff happening all the time. Let's do a thorough analysis of something timely and topical, and inform people's thinking about this. And now we know what's happening.
But with these last two examples, I agree on the first one being in engineering. And if you take a practical problem and you engineer the solution to it, I think on some level that is more immediately relevant than the other two, because I still think the kitchen and also your Alston papers, they so happen to be doing this research. And it so happened when it came out, it was at that time relevant to someone, to something, to some decision. And, imagine the echo chamber papers came out in 2035. I don't think it would, it wouldn't have created any impact to practice, because it wasn't it may not be an issue then. It was an issue when it came out, which was late summer 2020. So again, what I mean here is there's a notion or an aspect to relevance that you don't have under control. Or you can only control it by trying to time your process to publication so that it coincides with something you're likely to see happen, which is very, very hard to do. Yeah. The other thing, while I was looking up these papers, I don't know the Alston citation index, but I did notice the citation to the echo chambers paper. I just, when I Googled it, I found it, and it said it had 3 citations. And I just, I found that very remarkable, because I when it came out, I thought it was really interesting, was really relevant, was really timely. And, I was kind of surprised to see that by now, a year later, only 3 people have cited it. And I don't know.
Meanwhile, 100 media outlets have used it, right?
Probably. So. And the Alston paper, I would wager that this platform work probably hits 1,000 citations easily.
Yeah, I don't know.
Probably. Yeah, I haven't looked it up, right? And it could also be that the kitchen paper has a few more. But I found it very interesting to see that while it has relevance to, I guess, media and some people, it didn't have relevance, apparently, not so far, to us academics.
Well, that's the issue with a lot of the kind of econometric and very empirically based non-theoretical papers. I hate to say it, but they don't get a lot of citations, right? They don't cite each other. If you're looking at a phenomenon, coming up with insight from the phenomenon, you don't have to cite a lot of people. You just have to say what you saw, right? Same with a lot of analytical models. I've noticed that they don't cite a lot. They cite some folks, some touchstones, but then they don't get cited a lot either. And it's because, hey, here's my contribution. It's cool, but then it's not needed for the cumulative tradition necessarily.
So you asked the question whether this means that every paper needs to be relevant. But you know what I'm going to say now. I'm going to say no, of course not. Not every paper has to be relevant.
But people do get rejected for that, right? I mean, I had a paper that was rejected, not even a top tier journal necessarily.
For lack of relevance.
Yeah, because it's like, well, a practitioner, how's this going to help a practitioner? And then they rejected it, So there are people in the field that think that way, that if it's not relevant to practice, and then, there's this little game people play, which is we need some sort of, not every, but you mentioned an operations journal. Operations journals absolutely require this. They expect strong reflection on how this is relevant to practice, right? And I think there are some IS folks that do this.
Well, and if you look historically, I think it's at some stage after the initial rigor versus relevance debate from 20 years ago, I think for a while, at least the top IS journals also were really strong on practical implications, featuring in every paper, and really, where the editorial review team had a close look at this. I don't think at the moment that's still happening.
As a matter of fact, I'll go this far. Well, go on. What were you going to say?
Well, I was about to say, in the last couple of years, I don't remember one of the papers that I either handled or my own papers where the issue of implications to practice, that little section that sometimes appears in the back of the paper, I don't recall that being discussed in any review process where I'm the author, the review, or the editor.
I had one.
Yeah.
I had one where I was an author, and it was an old school SE, meaning someone who's been around for a couple decades. I think our generation, we kind of threw that out the window. We like it, whatever, but we don't require that little.
And I think that's good. That's what I like.
Well, let's look at this,
because not every paper has to be relevant.
Well, that's what you're saying. Well, see, now you screwed up with that particular statement because I wanted to back into it. And the way I wanted to back into that statement was this way. You asked to find some relevant papers before our call today. So, I was looking, and I looked at, say, MISQ and ISR, two big journals, and I looked at and I realized most of the papers are totally not relevant to any practitioner, right? So if a practitioner were to pick most of them up, they would be like, this is nonsense, right? Or if it's not nonsense, it's just like, this is academic navel gazing. It's nothing I can do. It's a lot about methods. It's a lot, we mentioned QCA as a method. I saw that one, and it's like, that's fine. It's relevant to IS researchers, but no practitioner cares about that. And there's so much of this stuff.
If you think about
conceptual
strong and weak papers on social materiality, right? So it's sort of like these two camps that say like there's a strong form of it and a weak form. How is that? That is not relevant. Like that's relevant to a lot of people in our field. It's not relevant at all to practice. I can't construe anything relevant in terms of impact on decision making. By anyone in a firm.
And then so number one is if your standard is relevance to practice, we failed miserably as a field if you look at any one particular article, because of the articles that are out there, only a handful in the last year are directly translatable to some sort of practice relevance, I guess. But then there are, I study enterprise systems, and I found a couple in MISQ on enterprise systems in the last year. And this is what I think, and this is my experience in working with practitioners. So one was Barney Tan's paper. It's a qualitative paper on enterprise system implementation, and they're playing around with the idea of sense making, right? And initiation, and then selection and retention during phases of enterprise system implementation. It's a nice conceptual addition to the abundant research on enterprise systems over the last 20 years, which is essentially an extension of just general IS research from the previous 20 years, right? And it's at this point all incremental, right? Any particular paper is made, but in the tradition of my own research and this is a nice additional element, right? So if I were to teach this, I wouldn't teach this paper. I would teach maybe an idea from this paper in the context of the last 20 to 40 year tradition, right? So I think there's something about, these papers. And then there's another one, Tracy Sykes had this paper where they looked at formal versus informal support in job satisfaction, right? Post-enterprise.
Well, that is relevant, right? So without knowing, I know which paper you mean, I don't know it in detail, I would say, but that sounds relevant to me. Like,
but there again, we'll go on.
If you're a manager, if you're trying to figure out, okay, I need to improve satisfaction with my staff, and here's a paper that comes and says, this is what informal controls will do. This is what formal controls will do in the context, I don't know, of an enterprise system implementation. That's relevant. That's like, oh, okay, I want to do that and not that one.
I get it, but if you really wanted to bring this out to an organization, like as a consultant or so, you would need to go back in the literature on formal control or formal and informal support structures, right? And then you would have to understand, how to do it. There's a lot more scaffolding you need to implement formal versus informal support structures than one paper and a few paragraphs describing it. Now they found a context, but there's 40 years of tradition behind this, right? And if you're going to teach it or implement it or do anything with it, you can't just use this paper. Which is
why no one paper should ever be looked at in terms of how relevant it is, because no good paper can actually ever be relevant. Like you can't take this paper has a relevant idea, has a relevant outcome. That doesn't necessarily mean I can go into the meeting room with my MISQ paper in print with this beautiful little title logo and give it to the people and say, now you go do your job. That's not how it works. And by extension, it means that this paper shouldn't even be addressed in terms of relevance. If there is relevant stuff in it, we need to figure out a way of translating that into practice. That is not the paper's job, and it's not the paper's author's job necessarily either.
All right. Well, wait. You just said it doesn't. Well, so we like relevance. We think it's cool, and we know there are papers that you could take into the meeting room and say, "Look, we're having it. We're Uber. Here's Wolf Ketter's paper. We can directly translate what they found into our practices."
I
We
doubt
don't
it. I just
need.
looked at the paper.
You know,
I doubt you can't take that paper into a meeting room either.
you
It's,
can.
it's complicated, that paper. Yeah. So if you wanted to go through these 40 pages, they have a lot of graphs, lots of numbers there. You got to figure out and read line by line to figure out where exactly that little thing is that does that and that much to the net profit line, right? So it's not as easy as taking the paper. That's my point. When I talk to, especially with other journal editors, when they talk about, okay, what do we got to fix this relevance problem, they all construe that problem to mean we got to make our papers more relevant, or we got to make more people read our journal, or we got to make sure that we get the MISQ papers to the CIOs of this world. All of which I think is nonsense. Yeah. And bound to fail. Like that, it doesn't work this way. Like, why would this paper that I'm writing is not written for CIOs? Of course they can't read it, and I can't necessarily even translate it. If you mean by translation that you find some sort of executive summary, practitioner version, not so complicated to read, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. If you make another paper from the first paper, that's a very bad mechanism to think about that.
And then you do an MIS quarterly executive paper or an HBR paper, a California Management Review paper, right? Which, it's a much different thing. It's more about selling your idea. You become a consultant. No one wants to see your research, and no one wants the cumulative tradition, right? They want the how-to.
Yeah, they want a how-to, or at least they want a new idea about how they look at things, like that, a new conceptualization, if you want to put it in academic terms. But really, sometimes you just want to see a shift in perspective, and they're like, oh, what if I look at my own organization this different way? I hadn't thought of that. That's fine. Yeah. So, and these journals operate differently, as you said, but that means that the normal papers, they don't have to do that as well. A lot of people say, oh, you got to do all the rigor stuff. You got to, you got to come up with your new theory. You got to satisfy all of us. And please also make sure that the next strategic director guy can also read it. And I think that's just plain wrong.
So what's funny? What I'm taking away from this discussion is, there are papers that we could construe as relevant, and that's all cool. But any paper doesn't have to be. And really, what's the most relevant? And even if I think of these, the ones that really impact practice the most and are the ones that are extending a cumulative tradition and well-grounded. And, this is my usual thing, right? Which is that you have to understand what has come before. And then you can, and any particular people, like when I go to practitioners, right? They usually need help with basic project management, basic leadership, basic change management. They don't need cutting edge stuff that came out last year. Oftentimes they need stuff from the 90s, right? They need to be reminded of vision, mission, goals, and how to align their KPIs with their strategic goals, right? Really, the stuff we teach in basic classes is what practitioners need to be reminded of when we're
So, and I agree. And I've been participating in a lot of executive education courses by different universities, and also sort of like coaching type of seminars where I go and talk to 20 managers of different levels. I'm not bringing an MISQ paper to that. I'm certainly not bringing my own either, right? I'm bringing very, very different papers to these classes. In fact, most of the time I try not to bring any paper. Most of the time I bring knowledge, not necessarily my knowledge, just knowledge that I think is relevant to them. And it could be by a variety of different people. And I bring it to these folks and say, let's read this, let's talk about this, etc. I would never dare bring my MISQ paper. I don't think it's relevant to any of them.
Well, Young Jin does. he actually does that. He has his students read his papers, and that's what he teaches, his papers. So he's interested, and I think you can do that. I think students do appreciate conceptual stuff, and his is different enough where like his digital first paper, right? He has this concept, which we would maybe argue, it's nice, but it's not relevant. But sometimes practitioners, when they're being educated, like that. Now
I take some of his digital first ideas when talking about executive as well. I think that has some relevance. So here's a story. Last week, I talked with John King. John King has started a new JAIS section, Journal of the AIS. and a section
What is
being
this section?
a new category of paper. You have research articles, you have commentaries, you have issues and opinions, and there's a new one now, and it's called a policy paper. And I'm not sure I'm getting the message across right, but the basic idea is that this is a forum where you can write sort of IS papers for policy, or even make policy proposals. Yeah, oh, wow. So he wants policy papers. So, and I asked him and said, okay, who's going to read them? I mean, is a policy maker going to turn to JIS and going to read these papers? And I said, I doubt it. Or are we reading this? And if so, what are we going to do with this? Do we like reading a policy paper? Am I going to read a JIS policy paper and now going into, I don't know, the next government building and talking about them? So I think this is a good example of what we're talking about here, because I like the idea and I like sort of fostering policy relevant stuff, but I'm not sure that's a good format.
And I'll tell you this, I mean, if you look at policymakers in the world, and they are not going to see JAIS.
Yeah, I know.
Think that's something you need to at least name it something. The policymaker, you got to call it the whatever Journal of Technical Policy or something, where someone who doesn't know anything about academia will see that and think it's reputable for they're not going to understand JAIS, will they?
Well, that's number one, and there's few examples of these. I didn't want to single that out. It's
interesting,
but AIS in practice, similar idea. AIS has a forum called AIS in practice, where they go through all the papers that come out in AIS journals, and they find one that they think is interesting or relevant. They're gonna approach the authors and make you do 5-6 bullet points, so really 100 characters, all that, so to speak, a little statement, and then they put it on the AIS website in this section called AIS in practice. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, why? Because that's not being read by anyone else. It's not that any practitioner would come and say, I'm going to go to the AIS organization website, but I'm not going to check the journals, but I'm certainly going to go for this AIS in practice thing. See, that's my big problem with all these formats, that they're inherently still only of relevance to the same audience, which is us. And I don't need the in practice version. If I find a paper interesting, I'll read the paper. Yeah. So I don't need the executive summary. And if you want to build executive summaries of all the cool research everyone is doing, that's fine. But then that's a horrible format, because it doesn't reach the audience that you're actually targeting.
No, and frankly, the word AIS shouldn't be in it, right? It can be, the AIS can sponsor it, I suppose, but it's got to be its own brand separately from the AIS. No one cares about the AIS except for IS researchers, right? No one knows what it is. We can't have journal of the AIS this, AIS that. You need whatever, even science, right? Is ASA makes science, but ASA is not in the title. I think it's ASA, right? They are not in the title of science. Science is just science, right? If we really wanted to affect policy, we would have something called tech policy, and then we would target those people who are the target audience that we think we have something to say for. If we have, again, like MIS Quarterly Executive, the name of that's awful. MIS Quarterly Executive, well, MIS is a 1970s acronym, right? MIS Quarterly, no executive knows what that means. And then, of course, the word executive is fine, right? But it shouldn't be about MIS Quarterly. It should be about whatever technology executive,
but there's
something
a historical
like that.
There's a historical reason for this, right? So it came out of the 40 years ago, when MIS Quarterly had some sponsorship with the Society of Information Management, a practitioner association at that time. So they sponsored sort of MIS Quarterly in the early years, and I also worked closer, I guess, with what is now the IS community. And they launched a practitioner journal, and they called it the MISQ Executive. So it was actually born out of a cooperation between an academic community and a practitioner community at that time. And once you have a journal,
what time was this? Do you know what year?
90s, I'd say. I would have to look that up. But it's a lot of this comes out of this rigor versus relevance debate that was prevalent, in the late 90s till the early 2000s, which again, historically, I think is interesting, because there was a time where the research didn't necessarily, didn't have the same relevance as our phenomena have at the moment, right? So this was a very different time, which also...
you look at MISQ in the 80s, those practitioners read it and wrote it. So articles were written by practitioners. And So that was very relevant and, arguably, I mean, rigorous for its time, I suppose, but there wasn't as much of a cumulative tradition to draw on yet, and methods weren't mature very much yet. So they could get away with a lot. But yeah, certainly MIS Quarterly is fine for research, and we understand what it is. But if we actually want to influence policymakers, and we actually do want a magazine for executives, and we want them to pay attention to us and compete with the California Management Reviews and Harvard Business Reviews of the world, it's got to be, we have to realize appearance matters, right? Salesmanship matters. We need, the name matters of the journal. People will look at it if it's a certain magazine or a certain journal. Now it can be backed by the AIS or whoever, that's fine. But the website, go to Communications of the ACM's website, right? And it's well done, right? The magazine articles are well done. You need to invest in the appearance and the design, as well as understand the symbolic elements of the naming. And then if you purport to affect a policy or practice, you need to step up your game, or just give it lip service, which is, I think, essentially what we're doing.
Yeah. So you asked me whether every paper should be relevant. My answer is no. Now, should every researcher do something relevant at some stage? I think that's probably a good idea. In my saying, like, we should be doing a lot of things, not necessarily all of us all the time, every time, but at some time it would be nice. See, when I was still in Australia, and in Australia you have all these large distances, so you travel by plane a lot. I always thought, if I wanted to increase the relevance of my work, I gotta get into this Qantas magazine. The glossy little magazine that is in every seat on the airplane, and the airplanes are full of managers commuting between Melbourne and Sydney and Sydney and LA and whatnot. Well, you want to be relevant, try to get into this magazine, and at some stage it was a goal I never managed, but I think that was a way to increase the relevance of my work, right? And so my point here is that, no, I don't think people should worry about making their papers more relevant. If relevance is one of the ambitions they want to pursue for a while at least, they got to think about, all right, what are better formats for me to engage and be relevant? So that could be that you're trying to influence policy by literally going to the places in the meetings where policy is being made, trying to get into these. It could be that you go more to the outlets that the practitioners that you want to speak to, that they read or listen to. Whether that be in Europe, it's still newspapers. In the States, it might be these glossy management magazines, and then there are other formats as well.
Well, and it's the websites, right? Harvard Business Review, it's all about their websites now, and people go there and get their
exactly right. You can go to these online forums as well. Some podcasts are speaking to practitioner audiences, like Sam Ransbottom's Me, Myself, and AI podcast. It's an IS guy, it's an IS topic, but he doesn't speak to us. He speaks to practitioners,
and that's
that
the whole
are dealing
thing
with AI.
If you want to be relevant, just do the thing you're doing, and then you'll be relevant. When I was way more relevant, I used to implement product lifecycle management systems, right? PLM. That was really relevant. I would go to people, talk to them about how to do that. I had a lot of experience doing that, and that was very relevant for people who were interested in implementing PLM. You don't need a PhD for that. For most MISQ executive papers, for most Harvard Business Review, California Management, any of these papers that you see out there, you don't need a PhD for that. This is not necessarily well-vetted research. It can be, but you can be a consultant. You can be a practitioner with an opinion and some experience, and you could write the same paper, right?
Yeah, or you can be on advisory boards of companies and advise them. There's a lot of ways to be relevant. And if you think about it,
that's not why I'm in IS. That's not why I'm an IS researcher, right? If I wanted to do that, I would have stayed being a consultant, right? I want to get into the weeds.
No, that's because you're one of these grand scholars. You want to think and you want to talk and you want to do theory. That's fine. But you got to say that even the university system would allow you to do that, because it comes with all this freedom. So if you want to be relevant, do that. You would have the time, to focus less on the next paper and instead be on more advisory boards, or go to more practitioner conferences, or speak more at their forums, or make sure you appear on the radio every other week or whatever. Like, all of that consumes time. But if that's important to you, and maybe it should at some stage be more important than your 47th paper, if you think about this way, then, the system allows you to do that. Again,
I don't know. Well, let's think about that. 47th paper, you're clearly good at writing papers. All right. So shouldn't you do what your gift is, right? If you're working with young people, teaching them the craft of writing a scholarly contribution. I don't know. I don't think we want to dismiss one or the other. I guess I'm just thinking that the practitioner stuff, you generally don't need a PhD for. That doesn't mean that some of the PhD stuff is not valuable to practitioners and can be translated. It's just that how do you tell the signal, or how do you tell the well vetted? Like, go to Harvard Business Review, look at some of their 5 things to do, in the with this new topic, whatever it is, right? Sometimes those 5 things to do are things you and I could have just come up with out of the air. Sometimes that's, comes from this like tremendous research project the authors did and they wrote up in some journal or some decades and decades of history and knowledge. We can't really tell. It's presented the same in all situations, right? They're the 5 things you should do tomorrow morning when you want to do X, right? I don't know, that genre is the most relevant in a sense, but it's also not necessary. It's hard to tell what's well vetted, what's not,
All right, I have another hypothesis that I want to run by you. I'm not sure this is, well, I believe so. I think there's some evidence to this. Hear me out. So, I'm in Germany now, and when you think of Germans, you always think engineering and design science, and a little bit is sort of like relevant work, etc. Right? So that's I guess
Germany's basically a country of engineers.
Yeah,
it's not a prejudice. This is a real. Sometimes these stereotypes have roots in reality.
So here's my hypothesis.
It's a country of engineers. Fair enough.
All right, let's run with this. So because I want to run with this. So here's my hypothesis. So about 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was this debate, all right, the North Americans run the journals and the Europeans can't get in it, and the Germans, they all do design science, but they don't know how to publish. And that was even featuring on some papers that were called Why the Old World Cannot Publish and so forth. Yeah. So here's my hypothesis. I think what happened around that time was then, especially in Germany and other European places, they lifted their games in terms of rigor. They said, okay, we have the relevance on our side because all of our trainings and our chairs and everyone, we're dealing closely with industry anyway, which I would testify to. That is true. It's very simple to build these connections here. But we have a rigor problem. So we don't know. We got to build up method skills. So a lot of what the German university did at the time, they would fly in some well-published American professor, come in and let them run the PhD seminars for a bunch of years. And they still do that. So I think what happened over the last 20 years or so, they kept their relevance and they really boasted their method skills, their rigor skills. And now really is the time they're really taking over. And because now more and more Germans are publishing left, right, and center in all the top journals, and they're still doing very relevant work. I'm still amazed by all the work that's being done. Now, here's my hypothesis. So that's number one. The other one is, I think, that America, or the North American system, they had that advantage of rigor, and they knew the literature way better, I would say, way better, but they never picked up the game on relevance. So they're still rigorous, but they're still doing the same boring stuff that they've done the last 20 years. Yeah. So, and that's why I think at the moment they're being overtaken, relatively speaking.
All right. I mean, come on. So those are some sweeping generalities about the American system. But as far as the German system, I think what you're saying is interesting, and it's true. Now, this is also what's happening. You have to realize the German system was this, your Herr Doctor Professor had essentially a consulting business going on. They had dozens of PhD students. They had dozens of, and they were essentially doing project after project with organizations. They had a ton of data and didn't know how to publish with this ton of data. So then they picked up some methods, are doing that. But then now what's happening is their students want their own identity. So you're essentially becoming the US. We're in this transition period where it's not the Herr Doctor Professor with his empire. Instead, it's, now there are professor, associate professor, assistant professor, right?
Yeah.
You're not necessarily working for the institute of the big guy anymore. You actually have your own identity.
So the institutional
You're not doing the habilitation. So it's starting to look like the US.
Yeah, the institutional system is being changed in a lot of places. So by and large, they're moving to a faculty-based system with, the open ranks and the different ranks and so forth. So that is happening, but I'm still saying coming out of that convergence move where everything is sort of every system is now starting to look alike, but they're coming out of it. They will come out of this stronger because they maintain their interest and appetite and relevance. They boast their rigor, and they shift into a system that is a little bit more, flexible or fair or, whatever. So coming out of that, they made a lot of changes, and I think they'll come out very strong out of this. What are the changes that the US have made in the last?
Well, all right. Years? So I think you're unfair in your characterization of the US a little bit, because yes, first off, there is a process by which you don't have a single bit of real world experience. You come work for a professor in the US that also doesn't have a single bit of real world experience. You continue their research trail in a well-established area, and then you get published and you keep doing this, right? So does the US system support that sort of approach? Absolutely. But to characterize the entire system as that approach is unfair.
Well, it's the same unfair as you just said all the Germans ran with one chair professor that had the students.
Well, that's how it ran. But that's how it ran.
That's the ones that you probably know of, not all of them.
They didn't all have a hair doctor professor, and everybody worked under the hair doctor professor in their institute.
And doing some sort of weird consultancy project? No, I don't think so.
For the most part, no. All right. I thought that was pretty much what
I think it was
German professors did.
My own experience, or what I've seen, was probably the dominant model. I wouldn't go as far and say like everyone did this. So yeah, of course, it's a sweeping generalization that I'm making in the same sense that you're making it. Right. I mean, that's why I put that forward.
All right, so you were busting my chops, because I'm saying, I guess what I'm thinking is the U.S. is far more diverse. Now, I will agree with you that there is a discounting of real world experience in the U.S. that doesn't exist in Germany, right? In Germany, a lot of your executives have doctorates, and there's a premium for people who do something in the world. In the US, not really. I was a business owner before coming to get my PhD, and it's like no one gives a crap about that. It's like I ran a business. And no when I was on the job market as a new, no one even, it's like whatever. As a matter of fact, at one place where I spoke to them, they said that, that's actually negative, because it means that I can go back out to
business. I had the same experience. And I'm not stuck in Australia. I'll give you this. What I always liked about that American system, and by extension also the Australian system, it's a lot cleaner. You do your PhD if you want to become an academic. If in Germany or Europe, you have the situation that people don't know what they want. I ask every incoming PhD, okay, all right, what do you want to do in 5 years? Why are you doing this? And they don't know. And at some stage, you got to make the call, because you can't just run on this dual strategy. Go back to PricewaterhouseCoopers, all become a professor. No, if you want to become a professor, you really got to put your eggs into the basket and you really got to go for it. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It may have worked 20 years ago, but it certainly doesn't work anymore now. We talked about this because the requirements of getting into the system are so high. That's a difficult thing here, because everyone does a PhD. Like literally everyone that has decent grades coming out of their masters does a PhD, but they don't know why, and they don't know what for. And if you don't know that, you also really don't know how you structure that program for them and with them, because it's very different. Like if you want to become a top manager, maybe you want to do your PhD by getting 5, 6, 7 different projects with companies under your belt, so you can sort of jump off them and then work with one of them. If you want to become a professor, that's probably not the best strategy at all. The best strategy is you want to become a professor, and all right, let's maximize your top shot publications. What are the best routes for doing this? Probably not running 7 empirical projects, right? So that's a difficult decision, and usually they have to make it at some stage.
And in the US, right, we have, probably 100 to 150 universities that are actually, research focused, but we have 800 to 1,000 accredited top business schools, right, where you can come get educated. So there's a lot of places to go if you have a PhD, and where you're not necessarily doing research at the top levels. Is there something like that in Germany where there are like elite research schools, and then all the others you don't have to actually publish or do?
Well, no. See, historically, the German universities, they were all reasonably good, but they're all sort of equal, to the point that when I started doing my undergrad, it didn't really matter all that much where you would go to study. They were all okay, I suppose. But then now, about 10 years ago, that changed when the German government launched its University Excellence Program, which is their equivalent of Ivy League. Yeah. Okay. And the story goes that they did so because of an interview that the dean of Harvard gave to the main German newspaper, the German Times. And he was asked, okay, what's the best German university? And he answers, I don't know. And then it was big outrage. How can it be that, Harvard doesn't know the top university in Germany? Which one is it anyway? And a couple
what
of
is the top university in
Well,
Germany?
I think, back then, the Technical University in Munich said, well, it's us, and some others said, no, it's not. And then they created this program and said, okay, we got to have some world-class elite Ivy League university because all the other places have it. England has it.
So what are they? How many are there in Germany?
Well, they're
right
10,
now? What are,
I think. And so it's probably like there's some sort of evaluation program every 5-6 years or so. It's a big program, lots of money involved, etc. And then they hand out this status of about 10 or so. So
is Hamburg one?
Hamburg is one. It's one of the reasons I went there.
So wait, Cologne wasn't on the list?
Cologne was, and it lost the status.
No.
Yeah, it's sort of like a primary league, and you can, if you don't win all your games, you get dropped.
Oh, so you basically left from Freiburg to
from Freiburg,
moved to Bayern Munich or something.
I'm not sure it's Bayern Munich. I don't think it's Bayern Munich or Academia, if there is such a thing. No, but no, there's a few places that are most would agree are sort of the top schools in Germany. Aachen is a world-leading engineering school, very famous. Munich, certainly. There's
the Munich one. How about Humboldt?
Yeah, Humboldt and Technical University Berlin. They're very, very strong. Göttingen, it's a medical place in Karlsruhe.
So I was told
anyway. So
I don't know if you know anything about American football, but I'm a Cleveland Browns fan, and the Cleveland Browns
literally never heard of the Cleveland Browns.
The Cleveland Browns are this once proud tradition that my entire life they've pretty much sucked. Right? They have occasional, but they have tremendous fan base, loyalty, but they just don't win. Right? And as a matter of fact, that's changing now. We finally have a really great team and everything, so you can start paying attention to Cleveland Browns. But I was telling some German friends about this, and they told me that, yeah, you're like the Freiburg of in the, I guess, the Bundesliga or whatever.
Freiburg in the Bundesliga, yeah, that sort of fits. Yeah.
They're just a little bit undercapitalized.
They are undercapitalized. It's a small team. Everyone loves them because, sort of home ground, regional, play nice soccer, then not even close to winning anything. So, but soccer is a bad metaphor because soccer is incredibly boring, to be honest. Like,
you're not a soccer fan.
Well, I'm sort of, for a German, no. In general, yeah, of course, a little bit. But
like you'll drink and sing the songs and go out there.
Absolutely.
You don't do that.
No, absolutely.
Really?
No.
I want to do that at some point.
You want to go out and do the Cleveland Browns song?
Yeah. Well, we don't do that. We bark. Because it's the dogs, right? The dog, so we bark like dogs typically.
All right. Can I, in closing this up, I wanted to bring up one more question that I had for you, and this is my question to you: what's your most relevant paper?
Oh hell!
Yeah, I thought you react this way.
Why didn't you warn me? So I don't know. Most of my papers are. I like to think of it as conceptual playing, but I would say I have two decently relevant papers. And one is with Carolina Salge, who's
on the bots, I'm assuming. The unethical bots?
Yeah, and it's just a quick thing we did. We studied a little bit of ethics and we gave in communications, the ACM, how do you know if your bot is behaving unethically, right? And then we just so that was one. And then and I'm going to shift. I'm not going to talk to you about our California Management Review paper or anything like that, because I think there are interesting things we've done that are relevant. The other one I will bring is my MISQ paper on enterprise systems. Back in 2019, it was published, and this was for my dissertation. We did a meta analysis of qualitative work. I think that is actually relevant in a way that it could be translated, and I could write a practice piece about it. And I think what my goal was in that paper is it's not a review paper, it's a meta theoretical paper, but it essentially reviews and takes, we qualitative people think in terms of usually either power or interpretation. And my take on this is power and interpretation combined on an enterprise-wide system, what plays out. And I think if I were to unpack that paper, of course it wouldn't be directly relevant, but if I were to translate it, it could be a very novel and interesting.
It's interesting because it's an odd choice, I thought at first, but you're right, I think, because meta-analysis, you did a qualitative meta-analysis. Normally that's a statistical term. It's a particular technique where you reassess the statistics coefficient of a large sample of published papers, right? Yeah. So it's coming out of medicine, which is incredibly powerful. So I would go out and say, we talked about we do research on a lot of relevant phenomena. So that all, some of that relevance carries into our papers, that they're relevant because we address relevant problems. Now, I also think there's some methods that are characterized by higher level of relevance, and meta-analysis is one of them.
Yeah. And meta-analysis are always cited the most. If I were to give advice to any young people, maybe don't do a qualitative meta-analysis, because
do it straight up quantitative.
But do a meta-analysis because they get cited, they build your. Now you have to give me your two most relevant.
Yeah. Before I do this, I wanted to now relax that notion of relevance, because we implied relevance to practitioners. But if you relax and say relevance to other audiences, relevance to students, to fellow academics, or to practitioners, if you think about what's then your most relevant paper?
Well, now then the word relevant begins to lose. And then you're just saying which one's my favorite, or which do I think will be the most impactful, or which. It'll be our managing AI paper that we just we're putting out, or it'll be my computational social. Or
that was my guess as well, right? Because that's relevant to people doing research using these types of methods and try and build theory with computational tool. That's a relevant paper for that, right? Yeah, so I would agree. The managing AI can be. It's harder to foresee, I guess.
Are you kidding me?
Has some of the ingredients.
Our frontier idea, and then our little three elements are totally facets.
Totally relevant. By the way,
if
anyone's listening to this, we are now in a position that we can send the paper out, I suppose. So if anyone's interested in that paper, let us know and we'll send it to you, because it's in production, which means it's sort of written and everything and signed off. So let us know. Okay, you asked me about
three. Then you have to have three now.
A three, like I'm going to give you one which I've always found is odd. My most cited paper is actually also a fairly relevant paper. It's a little paper called "How Much Language Is Enough," I think is the title, and it's a process management, a process modeling paper, and it looked at a new standard that came out and asked, what are people using it for, and how much of the standard are they really using? And I did it together with a colleague from Stevens, Michael Zumul.
Sure.
It's reasonably well cited, given that it's not a journal paper, and that was very relevant to that standards body, the OMG Object Management Group.
OMG, sure.
Yeah, because they revised the standard based on this paper and a few other papers. Yeah, they did.
So BPMN 2.0. This paper is reflected in 2.0.
Yeah, so in 2.0, and I think already in 1.2, they came up with the idea of, I think they call it conformance classes, which are basically advices saying, look, if you want to do this, then use this subset. If you want to do this other thing with BPMN, use this subset, etc. What we did at that time is we called them quite a bit. We called them and said, hi, we're doing research on your version 1.0. This is what we learned. So I also have another paper, which is actually based on my interview with Stephen White, who was the head guy.
That's really cool.
Of BPMN, awesome. Of the working group. So I think that was a relevant paper, so to speak. It was relevant to them. Relevant to fellow academics.
Jan Mendling just came out with that paper on notation in MISQ. Is that going to be similarly like...
He picked up I think in that paper, you mean he's got a theory review paper on problem solving, diagrammatic problem solving. He has directly addressed a gap, like a big gap, like something that this community that no people had really paid attention to, which is, what is the task? We use diagrams for lots of tasks. So what's with the tasks? So he has this framework, and they look at different tasks and they really work out, okay, for that type of task, you need that type of diagrammatic problem solving and so forth. So it was a big gap in the academic understanding, in our scholarly attention to it. It was good that it's finally done. Absolutely.
Because that's my issue with BPMN too, is that you can always just put anything in that box.
Yeah, of course.
Call the activity or the task or whatever, right? It's like whatever, just make a box in there, use a noun.
And that's of course what people do. Yeah. Of course, they're gonna put anything in there, and So I think that was relevant in that sense.
All right. So what's your other one? What's your most relevant to? Is it your most recent one? Is that the one you're gonna that one on representation theory, going beyond that, or no?
No, I think another relevant to people in sustainability in IS was that sense-making paper with
Yeah,
Stefan.
totally. Yeah.
In the sense of that created a vocabulary that a lot of people are using. Is that relevance to practice? I've been talking to practitioners about some of these ideas, but you know, you have to put a bit of heavy lifting into the translation. I would say you can't just go with this very interpretive paper and say like, here, read this and you'll be fine. But it has some ideas, I suppose.
You wrote a paper with like 150 other people on blockchains and BPM.
Yeah,
That's going to be, you're going to have 10,000.
but that's a
citations
manifesto.
on that.
Yeah, but that's a manifesto type paper. If you look closely, everyone in BPM is on that paper.
Yeah. Actually, you have a lot. I'm looking at your Google Scholar, dude. With BPM process modeling, and it's like you have 100 relevant papers here that a practitioner could probably read. Right?
Well,
Business process modeling, perceived benefits. Right. I've never even read this paper, but that clearly.
Yeah, that was a Delphi study. We did that at the time. We did a lot of, well, I guess very directly applicable stuff. Well, a lot of that stuff didn't come out in the Top IS journal because you can't publish it there. So it came out in a variety of other forums, other journals that I still think are completely fine. We publish a lot in the Business Process Management Journal because guess who reads that? You know, people either doing or researching business process management. And so you want to talk to these guys. Of course, you want to publish this. So I don't care that it's listed in B journal. That has more citations. You know, you attract a lot of interest there. So, oh yeah, here's one that I think was really relevant at the time, and it's very applicable with Teresa Schmiedel and Jan van Brocke from Liechtenstein. We did work on making culture measurable in the context of process redesign initiatives. A BPM culture.
I remember this actually. This was her dissertation, wasn't it?
It was her dissertation, and Jan and I, we were the supervisors, and we developed this instrument, and we applied it to lots of organizations. It was picked up by a lot of media as well for that time. That's very relevant.
Yeah, dude, so, I'm looking at your track record, and I would say our generation of researchers, right, that came out in the last 20 years, you may be among the most relevant to practice, like just looking at the title. And I know I've looked at your work in the past, but never with this perspective and this perspective of relevance. Dude, you're it. Like I would say 80% of these papers are relevant. Like a practitioner could probably pick them up. And if they're into anything around BPM, they would be fine, right? So you're probably very relevant.
Well, you know,
unlike me, whereas if a practitioner picked up my work, they'd be like,
well, it goes back to the training, right? This is still my mentor, Michael. He wrote a paper on increasing the relevance IS research. He was drilling that into us left, right, and center. He came out and said, there's no rigor or relevance. There's only relevance with rigor. That was one of his mantras. And so that's what we did.
That's cool.
So, you know, so that's that. So, but thank you. I think that's a perfect note to end this episode. Yeah. You finally, in episode 11, saying something nice about it.
Oh, I will say, and you're handsome.
Oh, wow. And with that lie. All right, folks.
All right, my brother.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. See you next time.